Well, I'm here in the Wexler studio, and Davey is here. Hi, Davey.
Hey, all.
Lily.
Hello.
Anna.
Hey.
And Ujwala is here. Hello, Ujwala.
Hello.
Good to see you. And Nasser Hussain,
Hi.
who has traveled here from Leeds via somewhere in Ontario, Windsor.
Windsor.
It's great to see you, Nas. It's
great to be
really
here.
great to see you.
It's great to be here.
We're excited, and we're going to be talking mostly about a new book published by Coach House Books, which is headquartered in Toronto, although Anna and Zach and I got to hang out with you in Montreal at the launch party, which celebrated this book, among others. It's called Skywritings, or Skywritings. And the constraint, which we'll talk much more about, is simply this. No word in the book is anything other than a 3-letter airport code. How do you write with that? So we've picked out 3 poems from among these many interesting, clever, funny, biting constraint poems based on that constraint. Picked 3 poems out. 3 poems that will resonate as a response to, maybe a critique of, maybe a nod toward, maybe an acknowledgement of poems that are familiar to people who care about the Modpo poems. One that's a response to Tender Buttons by Gertrude Stein. Another that is responsive to Christian Buck, his Eunoia. And the third, a response to Walt Whitman. So, Nas, would you be willing to read the 3 poems and then we'll just talk?
Certainly. I feel like I should take them in chronological order, like by poet. So
Great.
We'll start with Walter Whitman. This is a creative interpretation of Song of Myself. For Walter Whitman. Me, 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 me. Barbaric yawp. Me, 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 me.
Any snaps for that one? Thank you.
And then we'll move into the sort of high modernist frame with Tender Button for Gertie. Roast a cow. Mutton. Breakfast. Sugar. Cranberries. Milk. Eggs. Apples. Tails. Lunch. Cup. Rhubarb. Single. Fish. Cack. Custard. Potato. Asparagus. Butter. End of summer. Sausages. Celery. Veal. Vegetable. Cooking. Chicken. Pastry. Cream. Cucumber. Dinner. Din. Eat. Salad. Sauces. Salmon. Orange. Cocoa. And clears soup and oranges and oatmeal. Salad dressings and artichoke. A center in a table. And finally, for Christian Book, Eunoia. Enfettered the sentence says res fries each. The text del eats select ted letter. We see the revered eggs eat reject meat versa. The says tet, the terset. Even les sans élèves en grec. He rebels. He's et new precedence.
I want to collect first responses to the project, and then we'll get into the poems. Invite each of you to say one thing, and then Nas, you can respond, and then we'll start looking at the poems. Davey, what was your first response to this constraint and the experiment?
My first response was, sorry, Al, two responses. One of which...
You get two, Davey, because you have lots of license around here.
Thank you. One was being curious about whether this constraint turns air transit officials into poets or vice versa. Does it turn poets into air transit officials? And the other was to
That's
think...
your first thought?
Yes.
You're pretty extraordinary. That was like my seventh thought.
And my other was... to think about the weather, and to think about the weather because the IATA codes were developed in the 1930s for the National Weather Service. And so I was curious to think about how talking about transit and about place and about travel is a procedure of talking about weather. And we can talk more about that or not.
I'm sure we'll talk about both those points. That's great. Lily? First response?
Yeah, my first response is how much of the original, I don't know, do you want to say original work? The work but originally by the people for whom the poems are written, like Christian Book and Gertrude Stein, how
Not
much
so much
is...
Whitman, though.
No, and Whitman also, I think. Maybe
Lots of
a little less.
Me.
Well, yeah,
More
how
like
much-
I.
How much is present of the original work, how much you can hear more than see, I think. Like, it really brought out from Nasser's reading. When you just look at this, you don't necessarily, even if you're familiar with this chapter in Eunoia, you might not like see it immediately, but then to hear someone try to pronounce it, you can hear it, how similar it is to the original text.
For these particular poems, I think my first thought was, especially for Eunoia, this was already a poem that came through so much restraint, and then that this was possible was, I mean, the whole book for me, that was my first thought, that this is possible. And then coming here and being like, oh, this is possible too. And with the Whitman one, I was just like, I had fun. I was like, oh, look what he did.
Gotcha, Walt.
Gotcha, Walt.
Nas, what are your reactions to the reactions?
I didn't know about the weather thing. My very shallow dive into the history of the IATA, actually, I think positioned it around like the end of the First World War, when it became the end of the Second World War, when a kind of global sense of thinking came into play, and the need to codify the planet in a way became really important. So in that sense, a kind of global climate thing is kind of baked in there, yeah. That's really interesting. The sonic value of the poems is quite a challenge. I mean, I cheated a bit with Eunoia, or I'm forced to cheat, or I don't know if cheating is the right word, but I have to kind of dive in and out, and what I like. What readers, I think what you're picking up on are the sort of multiple reading strategies, where sometimes the word is what the word is, and sometimes you have to kind of piece it together, and sometimes it's doing both at the same time, and that's really, it's a challenge in performance, which I find really fun. And it means I can't really, it's going to be hard to read these poems the same way twice, ever. Which was a really unexpected...
Read as in perform?
Yeah, like to say it out loud, to perform, is... the fact that I can't get into a rut with them as I read them is really interesting to me. I didn't expect that as a sort of result.
It's a natural thing, at least for someone like me, to see a poem referring to or in honor of or influenced by or under the sign of another poet without thinking of, not in a Harold Bloomian agonistic sense, but in a we're all poets and we have different poetic stances sense. And you have a very different poetic stance from that of Walt Whitman in most respects. So let's take that poem, for instance. Sure. I want to ask my colleagues here for responses to whether Nas meant it or not. It's a critique of Walt Whitman. What is that critique? Who wants to start? Lily, what's that critique?
Well, I think just to hear, like, outside of a poem, if you would hear someone say the words me, you would think that it's kind of a stereotypical thing someone would say if you would make fun of someone for making everything about them by being like, oh, with you it's always me, me, me. So it feels like if you can take the tone from that comment, and maybe we can say, Nas can say if that's the critique he meant to be putting on Whitman.
So that's a good critique. Egocentric, to say the least, narcissistic. So that's one reading of me, me, me. It's me, 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 me. But the second reading is the eager beaver, me, 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 which Walt definitely is also. And then finally the me, 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 me. There's a Walt is always throat clearing. There's a lot of throat clearing.
I thought about that, the throat clearing in preparation for the barbaric yawp.
That's really good. Davey, I'll throw one out and you throw one out of
Sure.
possible
Yeah.
critique, and you can respond, and Ujwala as well. All these poems take their subject matter, in some cases other poets, and they turn them into journeys that are potentially treacherous, journeys that will be actually difficult to enact. In fact, the author, Nasser Hussain, despite his UK and Canadian passports, because of his name in let's just say 11, 12, maybe 2018, maybe 2019, coming into the United States, would have a little trouble making the trips actually work. So there is that disparity. I don't want to just stipulate that. We can talk about that later. But the point is that for Walt Whitman, there's no map. And the reason is because Walt never goes anywhere. And that's just a fabulous irony, given Walt's claim to a kind of transatlantic and also international passage of India way of being everywhere always. And Nas maybe intentionally has him stay more or less still. What's the airport? MEE? Do we
New
know?
Caledonia.
It's in New Caledonia. So, Walt is just there. Yeah. What do you think of that point, Davey?
But it also helps. Something that was super useful to me about the airport codes is that they're taking poets who we might not read within a global frame, and certainly not within a frame of thinking about colonialism and thinking about relations of power, and really demanding that we do that. That if we're going to take that, like, Whitman's funny because we don't always take him seriously as someone who's interested in implacidness, in really thinking about the blap of the pave as like the pave not being like a stage for human interaction, not just the social, but like a real material space. Like I don't know how much to take him as an urbanist. That's something that I like.
He may be a fake urbanist.
Right, I think he might be a fake urbanist. And this is demanding that if he's interested in a kind of like expansive, like, colonial appropriation, that we take him at his word and like think about what it would look like to locate him, to ground him in specific locations that are, I mean, these are municipal codes, they're part of state power. And there's something really lovely about you making experimental poetry out of nonsense framing designed to facilitate systems of state power. And there's also something really lovely about taking someone who has a kind of makes misuse of power look like generosity, which I feel like happens in Whitman's work a lot, and kind of hold him accountable for that. I think it's super cool.
Nas, before we turn to Stein, I want to invite you to say something about Walt, your relationship to Walt. I mean, I'm just going to say again, I think, and you can react to it, I think you're saying, Walt, it's not so free and easy. Everyone is constrained. Here, I'm going to show you how writing about you can be constrained. Ha ha ha, or welcome to the club, or I don't know what you're, if you're helping him along. Do you want to say something about you and Walt?
Yeah.
Do you have a relationship with Walt?
I think I do. He was formative in my, like, he's one of the first poets that I really started to understand what poems are for and what they can do. And I had that kind of, oh, this is going to sound terrible, and almost, that undergraduate naive kind of like, oh, this is what poetry is kind of moment, because he can do that. He's incredibly powerful.
The word is sophomoric.
Sophomoric. I'm in the wrong.
No, but I mean, I was literally
Yeah.
a sophomore when I discovered how great Whitman is.
Yeah, and since those days, I think my relationship has shifted or changed a little bit into different kinds of awarenesses about privilege and power and that almost egotistical claim to a kind of total identity So he's complicated. He's complicated. He's still good. I don't want to throw. There's a baby in that bathwater. I don't want to. I don't want to. Dispense with Whitman entirely. But I do have to. Yeah, I do feel like I'm sort of calling him out here a little bit.
Yeah, a little bit.
But there's love in it. Like it's not. Yeah, it's not harsh.
The love in it is the way in which you succeeded in making the barbaric yop fresh. Barbaric yop
Yeah.
is really a fresh take on the barbaric yop.
Yeah, because it calcifies so quickly.
Barbaric yop.
Yeah, into just everyone's doing their barbaric yop, and we don't really think about it, and that's part of the bigger project of the text in general is to like refresh, defamiliarize, look again,
Definitely. Make us pay attention.
pay attention.
All right, Gertrude Stein, Tender Buttons. So, Lily, we'll start with you.
Sure.
This is a rewrite, remake, rethinking of Tender Buttons. It's more aligned with Tender Buttons than Nas is aligned with Whitman, so it seems. Want to say something about any of that?
So I think, so if we think about, this would be like a butchering, like paraphrase of one of many possible goals of Gertrude Stein's Tender Buttons would be to kind of think about naming and referentiality and objects in a more open, expansive way, almost like she said to herself, like, I want to define or talk about objects using as many words that don't directly name the thing as possible. Right. So then, like, it's very funny to me then this is like not only this is doing a similar talking around but with a constraint and with like I feel like we're still trying to name objects but there's something getting in the way, and it's cool how you can still feel that something is impeding language from making direct contact with the thing it's trying to name, but the thing that's getting in the way is all the things we've already talked about, like whatever, airport codes, capitalism, but all the things that dictate what language makes up the airport codes.
Looking back at Tender Buttons from the point of view of a quasi-rigorous constraint procedural poem, which falls under the loose category of conceptualism as a process. Looking back at Tender Buttons and working with the Tender Buttons material to do that, do we discover a nascent or latent conceptualism in Tender Buttons? Is there a relationship? Can we move forward from the high modernism of Tender Buttons to the kind of conceptualism that Nasser Hussain is involved in?
I would say yes, because if I were to read Tender Buttons as a conceptual project, I would be doing a thing that I think Stein is already doing, which is thinking about the materiality of the objects that are there and the gender politics of the domestic space, and trying to think about like how do you think through the way that domesticity as a kind of feminized value is portrayed and like is socialized by means of like really hanging out with the stuff and the language around the stuff. How do you break apart and like spend time with and think through expectations of the domestic by getting like hyper close to it and making it weird? And I think that that's the heart of what conceptual poetry does, is develop a procedure to be able to break apart a social system that's produced in and produces language. And the crazy thing that's happening here is that this like rigorously like globally located set of places in these airport codes is the material being used to reinvigorate Stein's domestic. It's like Stein's domestic implacedness becomes a kind of global implacedness at the same time, which for me is like helping to identify what's conceptual about her project.
Geez, yes.
I'm getting chills.
No, that I feel the same way. I think that's exactly right. Wow. The way you went from the domestic concerns and the focus on the sign to Nasser's interest in the global. It's just great.
And I think
guess
that's
you're
great.
you're gonna respond happily to
Well,
this.
yeah, you're picking up on the thing that I was really hoping my readers would find, which is an unceasing attention to the geography. That's kind of the thing that's. I wasn't sure if that was getting across, but you've given me faith that but and I think the maps are doing a lot of that work of keep just always trying to remind the reader this is happening on a space, on a place, and the scale of that is global.
Super cool.
So thank you. Yeah, that's very close to the heart of this text.
One of the things that a lot of people say, and one of the sentences in one of my favorite essays, is that poetry is strewn around everywhere. It's just a matter of noticing it and picking it up. And a lot of time, what that phrase implies, or what I used to take it in as, was, noticing a ladybird, noticing this, noticing something that is happening, and creating that images or senses and transmuting it into words. But also both these projects and the projects that we've been looking at in Modpo with conceptual poetry and aleatory poetry was like, it's not just about noticing the things that are happening and the images and the sensory details, but also there's so much more. So it was like, yes, you're noticing things around you, but also that could be poetry, but also ways of doing poetry. So that's what these projects did for me. Yeah.
Nas, final thoughts?
I mean, I love what you just said there. I mean, above and beyond just noticing the world, or pretending that objects or food or rooms or politics or other people are in the world, I'm striving to remember that language too is a thing in the world and can be noticed, and that's that right now that's kind of the core of my practice is to pay attention to language like it's a thing in the world, and to take that 70s L equals Langpo kind of lesson as literally as possible, and it's yielding stuff. So that's kind of and I like to stay naive and have fun, as much as possible as well, because that's just as important as anything.
I have a final thought, and then I want to thank everybody for this really great session. Final thought. Well, I really enjoy the gamification side of this. I enjoy what the constraint produces in terms of pleasure. I enjoy the discovery. I enjoy the acrobatics. I really like all of it. And enjoy is the word. I mean, we've just laughed and smiled, which is good tonic thing for poetry to do. At the same time, I'm terribly moved by the work. Because just in terms of the 4 poems we talked about today, 2 of them about Walt Whitman, 1 about Gertrude Stein, 1 about Christian Buck. So here you are in the 21st century, well along in the 21st century, you come along and you have a certain amount of honor, feelings of honor and indebtedness to your predecessors who've been trying to break ground, and in all ways those 3 poets have broken ground in their time. And you are setting yourself a high barrier to cross over to get back to them. You are crawling on cut glass or climbing the highest border wall that has ever been built to get back over to these poets whom you honor because they helped make you free. They helped free your imagination. And this is a world. This constraint suggests a world of travel bans and impossible trips, and the limitation of freedom of motion, which has been promulgated as a right officially since World War II, some of the Roosevelt ideas, that we should be able to move freely between and among borders. And on this very day, surely, not to put too fine a point on it, but when I Googled Nasser Hussain, I should have Googled Nasser Hussain poet, because what I got was a whole lot of people, including a cricket player who's very free to move anywhere, but a whole lot of Nasser Hussains who would struggle to cross borders or be constrained by a certain set of assumptions about us and them. And these homage poems are so beautiful because they basically say, despite all that, I am going to cross back over to my people. And your people include the poets that came before you. So it's a kind of a labor of love. And you built the constraint. See, a lot of poets, when they honor Walt, they just do the Walt thing without constraint, because Walt wasn't constrained, so it just, right? And a lot of people who will honor Stein will do a Steinian thing. No, you said, this is what I have to do in order to get back to Stein. It won't be legit if I don't actually do it with integrity, this thing that I am committed to at the same time as honoring them.
Yeah.
And I just think that's a beautiful thing. That's an honorable thing.
Oh. If you can see that in my work, I can't say another word. That's beautiful. I have chills. You're all such great readers.
They are, aren't we? And so are you. Nas, thank you for traveling and hanging out with us. It's a
My
great
pleasure.
honor and pleasure. Davy, as always, Lily, Anna, would you want to hang out with us more? Would you like to? We'd really enjoy that. Thank you all.